Our first speaker is Scott Savage. Scott has spent the better part of 2 decades as a ski patroller, avalanche forecaster, and snow safety director at Big Sky Resort in Montana. And then he went to the Sawtooth Avalanche Center in 2012. He lives in Haley, Idaho, and has been the director of CAIC since 2014. Scott loves listening to geeky podcasts and occasionally sends them to me. He considers each day that he learns more than he forgets a success. Scotty's going to talk to us about wildfires and the effects on avalanches, so please welcome Scott Savage.
All right, can you hear me? Yeah, no? Oh yeah, there we go. All right, so this picture here, this is a fire that's still burning outside of Stanley, Idaho. It's about 125,000 acres that burned there this year. And up in central Idaho, this is it's become common in the summers over the last 20 years. This is basically the new normal, that we have these really large fires burning both within our forecast area and outside of it. So this talk will be a combination of some observations, just what we've seen over 20 years of this or 15 years of this, and a modeling approach to look at how does wildfire impact avalanche terrain. So this is back in 2007. This is downtown Ketchum, looking up towards the ski area at Sun Valley, which is this area. And this is the Castle Rock fire. So it just torched the Warm Springs drainage, which is this drainage out this way. And it burned right up to the edge of the ski area. Didn't burn the ski area, burned all the out of bounds and side country terrain near it. But it's been a great natural laboratory to just watch what happens as time has passed since that fire event. So the first 10 years or so after the fire, not a whole lot happened out in that drainage. And then things started getting rolling. This is predominantly northwest-facing terrain, so wet avalanches. This guy's probably starting to get a little nervous, I think, about where this is going to end up. Doesn't quite make it to his house. Sure, got his blood pumping though. This one wasn't so lucky. This is the next year, I believe, and that's local legend Art Mears, who I think is in the crowd. That's him there checking out the destruction. This was another wet avalanche in the Warm Springs drainage that came down and destroyed a house. And we've seen structures get destroyed. There are a lot of urban impacts in that drainage in Warm Springs. So another house, multiple cars that have been buried on the road down there or pushed into the creek. And this is that terrain right outside of the ski area at Sun Valley. And by right outside, I mean right outside. You go 10 feet outside the boundary and now you're in burned avalanche terrain for a lot of it. So this was a double burial. They both self-rescued and got out, 2 kids. And it's frankly been amazing that we haven't had any fatalities, whether it's structures, vehicle, backcountry skier, side country skier. So far so good. But we've seen hundreds of thousands of acres burn within our forecast area in the past 20 years. And Warm Springs is it's been a great natural lab. That's the best way to describe it for watching how these fires impact the terrain. So the previous research on wildfire and avalanche, that interaction, a lot of it has been focused on the snowpack. So there's a fair amount of work looking at, how do these ash layers impact the hydrology, so the energy balance and the surface reflectivity. As far as weather, not a lot of work's been done. Some people have looked at how the wind patterns change, which would be pretty obvious, right? You lose all that tree cover and all the canopy, it's going to change the wind patterns. So there's a little bit of work there. But we really wanted to focus on terrain and how does fire actually change the avalanche terrain. And if we take a look at the previous work done on that, there it is. It's a blank slate pretty much, which is what we want, right? You want to look at something where there's not a lot of work done. That's the formal published work on the interactions of wildfire and terrain. There are people, a lot of people who've been thinking about it, watching what goes on and writing about it. Carl Clausen up in Canada has done some work. Doug Abermite, while he was still around, did some work down in my neck of the woods around Ketchum. And yeah, so I'm not saying no one's thinking about this, but there's not a lot of published research on this topic. So then we'll fast forward to 2022. This is the Ross Fork fire, just south of Stanley. For those of you that are familiar with the area, it's around the little town of Smiley Creek. And this fire burned about 40,000 acres. And I've been talking over several years with a friend, Eric Peitsch, who you'll hear from later today. He's an avalanche and climate scientist, about what can we do to study this, to take a look at it, at how does fire change the equation. And then this winter, I got really busy. It was 2022-23, which was just a crazy winter for us. We had multiple cycles with extreme danger that verified, all kinds of avalanches that were, relatively infrequent, long return period events, where all the locals are like, wow, I've never seen that before. And, take it with a grain of salt, never means a lot of different things. But it was a pretty exceptional year. So it gave us this great opportunity that you have a fire that burns, and then you have tons of avalanche activity that doesn't happen very frequently, both inside and outside of the burned area. So a great opportunity to look at things. So we got a team together in the spring to try to take a look at what's going on there. A few folks that I definitely want to acknowledge. So Zach Miller, who works with Eric at the USGS outside of Glacier National Park, is a research scientist. And he'll actually be joining our team at the Sawtooth here in a few weeks, which we're really excited about. And then John Sykes, who just finished up his PhD at Simon Fraser University and works as a forecaster at the Chugach National Forest Avalanche Center. They did the technical heavy lifting on this project. And then Megan Ginn, she has a background in hydrology. She contributed some work. And then Ben Vandenbos, myself, and Eric were basically feeding these folks ideas and observations. So with this group, we chose the Ross Fork, which is the area in red, the Ross Fork fire, for the target or the study area. And for those of you that are familiar with it, there are two drainages within that fire, Beaver Creek and Smiley Creek. They're roads that go up both of them that in our area, they're really heavily used for motorized recreation. So a lot of snowmobiling in this area, which we want to have it, see, given that we work at an avalanche center, we want to see what is the impact on terrain for, recreationists and people within the forecast area. And then I will also say this is a relatively wet part of Idaho. So in general, on the order of maybe 40 inches of SWE in the winter, compared to Ketchum, that Warm Springs drainage is about half that, much drier. So different snow climate in this area that we're looking at. This is true. And I'm not going to show any equations, but we are going to talk a little bit about modeling just because this is a modeling project. So this looks really scary, but in 30 seconds, you guys will have it nailed. You'll understand what we did. So this workflow, auto 8, so everyone has heard of 8s, the avalanche terrain exposure scale, I think. So this was developed by Hovard Toft, a Norwegian, and John Sykes and Andrew Schauer and some other folks to automatically characterize that terrain within that avalanche terrain exposure scale. The two things that you have for input are slope angle, which you get from LiDAR-derived digital elevation maps, and then forest cover. So the forest cover is just a combination of stem density and the amount of tree canopy cover that you have. So you want to look at that pre and post-fire. And that was derived, we used Zach Hoppinen is his name now. It used to be Keskinen, and he's really skilled at playing with satellite imagery. So that's how we got that data. You take those two, you feed them into the first model, possible release area. So the idea with that model is it's going to predict, is this area, any point within that, whatever you're looking at, that area, is that point in a potential starting zone for an avalanche? Make sense so far? So you look at how that changes pre and post fire. Then you take that possible release areas, you want to know what happens to that snow if you have an avalanche that starts in that area, where does it go? So FlowPy is a gravitational mass flow model that predicts, characterizes, tells you where does that moving mass go, and then where does it end up? And you also obviously have to look at the slope angle and the forest cover that's in the way of that mass that's moving downhill. Then the final thing is the auto aids classification, which basically looks at gives a severity rating for the amount of overhead hazard for any point within that. So that's just a very brief, very simplified version of the techniques used here. But it was great that something already existed, this workflow, so we just adapted something that was already there for different reasons and to look at fire pre and post. So the results for the forest cover. So this is the change in tree canopy derived from that satellite imagery, and the red represents where there's a change in tree cover, a reduction in canopy. And you can see it's a fair amount of terrain. Yellow is where it didn't change, red's where it did change. And this on the right-hand side is the burn severity map taken from the Forest Service. So you can see that the areas that are red align pretty well with where the fire burned at either high or moderate severity. So far, so good. And then the change in possible release area. So this is that first model, and the color, don't want to do that. So the red represents where you have an increase in starting zones. So this is just a binary yes or no. You can drill down a lot more, and I'll show you a link to the paper that you can read on this if you want to get into more minutiae on the details. But just at first glance, it's pretty obvious that there's a significant increase in starting zones within the burned area. And then where are these changes in the starting zones? So where is the increase? So growth partition, that means existing starting zones. So you had areas that were already capable of producing avalanches, and those starting zones grew. They got wider, taller, they expanded. That was roughly 2/3 of the increase in possible release area versus brand new starting zones, so places where avalanches didn't occur before, but now they could. That's about 1/3 of it. And a good way to look at that, so the new starting zones, which you can see up in here, they're generally smaller areas. This wasn't avalanche terrain before. It wasn't producing avalanches. They tended to be smaller, more on the order of like 100-foot by 100-foot starting zones versus the existing ones that were expanded. So in this photo, you can see basically the green area here. It used to be a small avalanche path, really confined. And after the fire, that probably involved snow from up in here, definitely snow from up in here, created a much larger avalanche that took out all this burned timber, took out all of this burned timber, and ran way down there. So much different story. And that was the case in roughly 2/3, where you had existing starting zones that then grew post-fire. So we did have some bigger slides, not very many though. This is a D4 that came down and increased the historic runout zone. One interesting thing about this winter was I think we only saw 2 or 3 D4 avalanches the whole year. There was a ton of avalanche activity in really strange places where we hadn't seen it in probably 20 to 50 years, talking to a lot of the folks that have been around for a long time. But this one was fairly unique and probably resulted from that same example of expanding the existing starting zones. The starting zones are about 1 mile wide above this runout area, and they're separated in a lot of spots by tree islands that all burned. So probably, even though it wasn't necessarily that deep of an avalanche compared to previous year's events, it was just that much wider. You're able to connect the dots. But it's a kind of a segue into now we're going to look at runout zones. So where do these things end up? So if we look at, this is the second model, that flow pie. So where does the massive snow end up when it's at the bottom? And on the left-hand side, we have pre-fire over here. And black means that it's safe, so basically 0 runout potential. And the color means that it's potentially in a runout zone. So you can see the obvious changes from pre-fire, a lot of black, to post-fire, much less. If we look at this more numerically on the right-hand side, there we go. So this is pre-fire, and you have 57% of the area within the study area was not a runout zone, so basically safe. We lost 17% of that was safe became in a runout zone. So numerically, it's about a 17% increase in the avalanche runout area. And if we drill down for what are the implications on exactly where that happens, this is where it gets really interesting. There's some big implications. This is the Beaver Creek drainage in the circle. And there's a road that goes right through there, through the black, that historically has been, this is pretty safe. It's a couple paths, but really rare avalanche activity, really infrequent. Compared to, look at it now. You're just in, you're in the bowling alley. You could get hit from avalanches on both sides of that drainage, almost the entire length of that road. So for where you're concentrating all the people down in the valley bottom on sleds or on skis or whatever they may be doing, it has some, really large implications. This is a video down on that road in the Beaver Creek Road. And there was a few hundred yards of it, or a few hundred meters of the road that looked just like this after year one that were obviously, heavily impacted. And this is in an area that, never gets hit pre-fire, that it was basically safe terrain. Then looking back up at another example of an existing starting zone that was, widened and just involved a lot larger mass of snow coming from above. So the observations in year one definitely supported the modeling results, which was good to see. So then looking at the next modeling approach, the overhead hazard or the auto 8s, you can see that the area that's no hazard, and what the 8s does is it basically bins into multiple categories of how hazardous, how severe is that overhead hazard. So blue is safe, and pre-fire 58% of the terrain in that study area was safe, decreased to 41%, so a significant decrease there in the amount of safe terrain, or the overhead areas with hazard increased by 17%. And I think even more impressive for me is the areas with high or moderate overhead hazard, it was 14%, went up to 21, so a 50% increase in the areas with moderate or high overhead hazard. And yeah, just the big implications on the valley floor, this is just a different part of that road down on Beaver Creek that was, no hazard, that became, for sure some, who's to say whether this is exactly in the moderate or high hazard, but just a big deal for places that were effectively 100% safe or as close as you could get to it, becoming not that way, has some, big impacts on people. So what? So what does it mean, and what should you remember out of this? Handful of things. Historical knowledge can be a disadvantage at times, and this is one of those where the safe zones that for the people that have been out, working or recreating in this area for decades, for them to have their existing safe zones that they've been relying on forever now be not safe, that can be really problematic. So you definitely need to, if this happens to you, if you're in an area where it's burned or beetle kill, because this applies to any deforestation event, it's not just fire. Definitely plan and travel like you'd never been there before. Try to go into it with open eyes. It's a really dynamic environment post-fire. So it changes what we've seen, each drainage, different snow climates, aspects, you name it. They change month to month, year to year. That Warm Springs area, it took about 10 years for things to really get rolling, to see the avalanche activity in there, whether that was because of the specific weather and snowpack in those years or the root structure weakening over time, so it made it easier to knock those trees down. It's hard to say. Beaver Creek, in contrast, where the Ross Fork fire was, that happened in year one. There was no 10-year lag when we started seeing really significant unseen or new avalanche activity. And we have seen both wet and dry activity, even on north-facing slopes, a lot of wet activity. So it's definitely a dynamic environment, and expect to be surprised if this happens. And really, it just points out that a lot more work's needed to really look into this. What are the patterns and causes of post-fire avalanche activity?
Here we go. Fuck that shit.
This is up Warm Springs. This is a good example of.
Not good, man. Run, man. Keep running, keep running, keep running, keep running, keep running. Keep
So that's their
running,
groceries.
keep running.
These are some guys that are, you know,
Fuck, that's
caretakers
very
or
There goes
they're
my
up taking
shopping.
care of some really wealthy folks. Let this finish up.
Nick, you're shitting me, man. What the fuck? Fuck. Excuse my French.
Then he says, pardon my French. But picture that you need to let folks know, like these folks, or maybe it's plow drivers or ski area managers, that things are different now. And it's a real communication problem, trying to make sure that people understand that, yeah, we haven't had avalanches in this area before, but now we're going to. So be prepared for that you're gonna have some challenging communications with people who, whether it's in your work or recreational, contacts, they're not gonna understand this, and it's gonna be a lot harder for them to wrap their heads around how this is a whole new ball game than it is for you to wrap your head around that. And who has sledded or skied in burned terrain? Nice. It's fun, right? It is awesome. I mean, it's beautiful. It opens up all kinds of new terrain. It's so cool. What do you think our brains are doing when we're in an area like this? It's just absolutely beautiful and you're having a blast. Yeah. And are you making good decisions? Yeah, when we're in that hot state, when we're really excited about something and we're having a blast, it's really hard to make logical, real-time, split-second decisions. So, recognize that, and there was not the last ISSW, but one before in Bend, there was a Norwegian researcher who said, yeah, so the way that our brains are operating when we're in this hot state, it's more akin to a sexual encounter. So how good are you thinking when your pants are around your ankles, is how he described it. And he's right, though. We're just not capable of making really good decisions. So be aware of those decision-making traps, that you're going to be even more prone to them when you're in these areas, potentially. And that's at work or at play. It doesn't matter. You're still not going to make as good of decisions as you would in an area if you're not having that much fun and you don't have that brain chemistry cocktail going. And then I'll end it with, there's a lot more work to do. We just scratched the surface with this study. It's more a proof of concept. Not on a large scale. The modeling did appear to work reasonably well. We were really lucky to have a probably 20 to 50 year return period winner in year one to look at what happened and to be able to play with the dials and the modeling a little bit. I will reiterate, this is applicable to any deforestation event, so whether it's beetle kill, wildfire, it's anything that reduces the tree canopy, that this approach would potentially work for you. And I really hope it becomes a hot research topic and we get a few people nibbling at it here. So any prospective PhD students, they should talk to Eric after this, and I think he'll probably sign you up to help him out studying this going forward. With that, since I do work for the Forest Service, got to point out that the safest place if you're in a big avalanche in a burned area is the Forest Service crapper. There was a campground surrounding this that didn't do as well as the crapper. And the QR code is to the paper if you want to read some more about that modeling approach. Well, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Scotty.
Thank you.
Thanks, Scotty. That was a super interesting talk. We do have time for a couple of questions. So raise your hand and we'll try to get a mic to you. There's one down here. Also, please take the time to come in and take a seat. There's a bunch of seats down here in the front.
So I've poured water on a fresh burn, and it's better than a fresh Gore-Tex jacket as far as its shedding ability for just having water run off.
I'm having a hard time hearing.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe just try one more time. We're getting a little feedback on the stage, so just try to speak slowly and we'll pick it up.
All right. So I've poured water on a fresh burn, and it sheds water like a brand new Gore-Tex jacket.
So meaning on a fresh ash layer on the snow surface?
On fresh ground. So, I mean, in some cases, probably wouldn't affect avalanches, but I would think for a wet slab, that would have much more an effect, or might affect how it the friction during an avalanche and increase the area? Is anybody thinking about researching that?
So I think the question is, when you have a burn, it affects the actual ground, where it can scarify it, torch it, and how does that change impact potential avalanches? We haven't looked into that. I mean, that's a good question for someone who knows a lot more, I think, about glide avalanches, which would be a question for Eric if he wants to address it later. But we haven't looked into that at all. It's something that is for real. It's another good topic to look into.
We have time for maybe one more question. There's one in the back.
Yeah, good question. Yes, is there any correlation between the avalanche problems, wet versus dry? I think we don't have enough data to make any hard conclusions about that. Warm Springs, that drainage, there were no trees on the south-facing slopes because it's such a dry climate. So the only things that burned were north-facing for the most part. And it's been interesting where we've seen a lot of wet activity in that drainage. In the Beaver Creek area and other surrounding areas, it's a mix of wet and dry. But I do think on the more northerly aspects, the amount of wet activity in burned areas may be more than you would intuitively think. I could say that. But yeah, we haven't done enough work to really to answer your question well.
Great. Thanks, Scotty.
Thank you, Ethan.